We cling to the comforting delusion that we are the sole authors of our own lives. We wake up, lean into our rigid routines, and blindly assume that the path ahead of us is secure and predictable. But on October 21st, 1988, 3 completely ordinary people woke up in Buenos Aires, Argentina, utterly unaware that they were already moving on a fatal collision course. They were total strangers. They had no shared history, no mutual friends, and absolutely no logical reason to ever cross paths. In any normal version of reality, their individual timelines would have remained entirely parallel, never touching. But a sequence of completely separate, mundane actions was quietly pulling all 3 of them toward the exact same coordinates on a city street. They had no warning that their lives were about to violently intersect. By the time the afternoon ended, a single, highly improbable event would trigger a dark, unstoppable chain reaction, binding their fates together in a matter of minutes. This is the story of that Friday in October and the 3 lives that collided in the worst way imaginable.
For the first of these 3 people, 75-year-old Marta Espina, it began as a completely ordinary Friday afternoon. The weekend was approaching, and the weather in the Caballito neighborhood was typical for a spring day in Buenos Aires. Caballito was and still is a bustling, densely populated residential area filled with high-rise apartment buildings, local shops, and steady pedestrian traffic. There was absolutely nothing unusual about the day. There were no warning signs, no signs of danger, and nothing that would have caused Marta to hesitate or think her afternoon would be any different from 1,000 others she had experienced in her 75 years. She was simply walking down the sidewalk, navigating the familiar pavement of her neighborhood, completely lost in the anonymity of a city afternoon. Then, without a single moment of warning, something fell from high above. It happened with such terrifying speed that Marta would not have had the time to look up, let alone react. The object plummeted through the air and struck her with such immense force that she died instantly on the sidewalk. The immediate aftermath on the street below was defined by absolute confusion. For the people standing just a few feet away, the world changed in a fraction of a second. Some bystanders who witnessed the impact froze in total shock, unable to process the violence of the moment. Others immediately rushed towards the scene, their eyes darting up towards the surrounding balconies in a desperate attempt to understand what had just occurred. Within minutes, a large crowd began to gather around the location. They were drawn in by pure bewilderment, united by a collective need to answer the exact same question. Everyone standing on that sidewalk was trying to piece together a puzzle that made no sense. They stayed because they were entirely consumed by the unknown, desperately trying to understand what had just fallen from the sky, and where could it have possibly come from.
As the commotion grew, the energy on the street shifted from confusion to a palpable, heavy chaos. The gathering crowd naturally began to spill outward, attracting people from the surrounding blocks who heard the shouting and the gathering sirens. One of the individuals drawn to this unfolding scene was a 46-year-old woman named Edith Solá. Like everyone else arriving on the street that afternoon, Edith had no connection whatsoever to Marta Espina. She was not a family member, she was not a friend, and all evidence suggests the 2 women had never spoken a single word to one another. Edith was simply another resident of Buenos Aires who happened to be in the wrong place at the exact wrong microsecond. The only thread connecting these 2 women was the crowd itself, which was steadily growing larger and more disorganized. And as news of the sudden death rippled through the onlookers, the sidewalk became completely congested. The air was filled with people pointing toward the upper apartment balconies, debating what might have dropped and trying to catch a glimpse of the sidewalk below. Edith stood right in the middle of the swelling mass of people, completely distracted by the same confusion gripping everyone else. And it was during this peak of absolute distraction that the second tragedy occurred. While standing near the edge of the dense crowd amidst the noise and the shifting bodies, Edith stepped off the safety of the curb and entered the active roadway. She never saw the city bus that was approaching the block at that exact moment. The bus driver slammed on the brakes, but the heavy transit vehicle carried far too much momentum to stop in time. Edith was struck by the bus and killed. Within the span of just a few minutes, 2 women lay dead on the exact same stretch of road. And at that point, the panicked onlookers trying to process the second horror had no idea that both deaths traced back to the exact same initial event.
If you had interviewed the people standing in the street at that moment, you would have heard a wide array of logical, realistic theories. Spectators assumed a heavy piece of construction equipment had broken loose from a rooftop project. Others guessed that a malfunctioning air conditioning unit had fallen from a window frame, or perhaps a heavy chunk of masonry had detached from an aging facade. It was completely obvious that whatever fell possessed massive weight to cause an instant fatality upon impact. The actual truth, however, was something that none of the witnesses, the police, or the emergency responders could have anticipated. The object that had fallen from the sky was not a piece of building material, concrete, or machinery. It was a small poodle named Cachi. According to contemporary newspaper reports from the following days, Cachi belonged to the Montoya family. The family lived high above the bustling street on the 13th floor of one of the adjacent apartment buildings. For reasons that have never been fully explained or legally documented, the dog went over the edge of the balcony that afternoon, falling approximately 13 stories. Neither the dog nor Marta Espina survived the resulting collision. This is the point where the historical record becomes deeply frustrating for researchers. Despite this event gaining international fame over the last several decades, turning into a well-known piece of bizarre history trivia around the world, the exact mechanics of how the dog fell remain entirely blank. Media reports from October 1988 briefly mentioned that maintenance or repair work had recently been carried out on the Montoya family's balcony, but no official conclusion was ever publicized. The investigative files leave us with nothing but unanswered questions. It remains unclear if the dog managed to squeeze through a temporary gap left by the workmen, lost its footing while running along the ledge, or became startled by a sudden noise from the street below. Furthermore, the Montoya family themselves completely vanished from the public narrative almost immediately after the incident occurred.
The human toll of that afternoon extended far beyond the sidewalk, stretching deep into the private lives of those who were left behind. It is worth considering the unimaginable perspective of the family inside that 13th floor apartment. One moment they were at home on a regular Friday afternoon, and the next, police, emergency vehicles, and a growing mob of international journalists were swarming the pavement directly beneath their window. There are no archived interviews, no public statements, and no formal explanations from the family regarding how they processed the sudden loss of their pet and the catastrophic loss of life it caused. The only preserved perspective from inside the building comes from a single neighbor who briefly told reporters at the time to simply imagine how the Montoya family must feel. The chain of tragedy, however, was still not finished. According to contemporary reports, it claimed one final life. Among the dense crowd witnessing the frantic aftermath of the first 2 deaths was a man whose identity was never widely disclosed to the public. According to local newspaper accounts published in the days following the event, this bystander watched the entire scene unfold in real time. He witnessed the immediate, shocking aftermath of Marta's death, the frantic gathering of the crowd, and the sudden, violent impact of the city bus striking Edith Solá. According to those original reports, the sheer shock, horror, and psychological trauma of witnessing back-to-back fatal accidents right before his eyes was just too much for his system to endure. The man suffered an acute, massive heart attack right there on the street. Emergency medical personnel immediately loaded him into an ambulance for transfer, but his condition deteriorated rapidly. He passed away before the vehicle could reach the hospital doors. If every detail of the contemporary reporting is accurate, that would bring the final count to 3 human fatalities, all branching out from a single quiet moment on a 13th floor balcony.
Unlike the deaths of Marta Espina and Edith Solá, which are matters of indisputable public record, this third casualty remains more difficult to verify with absolute certainty. Because the man's name was left out of major reports, several historians and investigative journalists over the decades have questioned whether this final detail was an exaggeration, a piece of folklore that grew as the story was translated and shared globally. What we do know with certainty is that the local newspapers printed the account as fact during the week of the incident. Whether the final piece of the chain reaction unfolded exactly as described is a detail that has been permanently obscured by the passage of time. But even if we look strictly at the verified facts, the sequence remains one of the most extraordinary and deeply unsettling anomalies in modern urban history. The narrative sounds like a piece of dark, surreal fiction rather than historical reality. Yet, it happened, and nearly 40 years later, the event continues to be studied, discussed, and remembered. This story endures because it lacks a villain, a motive, or a traditional mystery to solve. Instead, it forces us to confront an unsettling, ominous truth about the world we navigate every single day: the sheer, unpredictable, and devastating power of raw chance. Also, you can't help but to ask the bigger question: are our stories predetermined by destiny or a greater force? Or was this really just an incredibly unfortunate matter of being at the wrong place at the wrong time? Let us know your thoughts below. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Unalived Weekly. We look forward to seeing you again next week.